So again, thank you so much. And I think the gist of my research that I'm presenting today on Sappho is to try and say something about epistemology, about the kinds of things that women and everyone can know about our bodies that aren't usually trusted in our everyday ways of thinking about knowing, especially as philosophers. And again, I thank Ruth and also George Vlahakis for encouraging me in my research on Sappho. This small piece is part of one of the book chapters that's forthcoming with the Routledge volume on women in ancient philosophy. Okay, so Sappho, thank you, Dr. Sappho of Lesbos is best known as an early Greek lyric poet and songstress, especially for her homoerotic verse. My students tell me they don't know who Sappho is. So now I see it's very important that we introduce it. So if you know all about Sappho, I apologize for introducing you to her. But in case you've never read Sappho or don't know, I'm going to introduce her to you. Indeed, as André Lardinois notes, even in antiquity, it was the erotic content of Sappho's poems and songs that were best known. Probably as a result that the erotic content of her work garnered, Sappho is not typically recognized as a thinker, let alone as a philosopher. As David Robinson explains, even despite that she was recognized in antiquity for her extraordinary poetic talent, and was even described as the poetess, a distinction that placed her in the same company as Homer, who was known as the poet. She's not typically known even for her unique abilities in composing songs and poems. The subject of her verse has eclipsed the brilliant way that she wrote about it. If Sappho's poetic legacy has been occluded by history, it is unsurprising that her standing as an original thinker has been likewise relatively uncelebrated. On the one hand, this has to do with Sappho's style. She didn't put forth formal arguments in her writing. On the other hand, it has to do with a bias against the content of her songs and poems, which is to say that some scholars don't seem to think that desire and emotions are properly philosophical content. Take, for example, Jenkins's view that Sappho does not preach or argue or deal in complex or difficult ideas. In contrast to the view that Sappho's ideas are not complex nor difficult, Aristotle cited her views on death and the rhetoric, and in the 20th century, Robinson ended his thorough study of her work and influence with the conclusion that it constitutes a great and noble literature, even remarking on her unquestionable genius, stating it so plainly as to compare Sappho's extant verse to a fragment of sculpture where the artist's talent is clear, regardless that only a piece of the original creation remains. Even further, Paige Dubois has stated her desire to make a scene in order to establish Sappho's rightful place in the history of Western civilization. According to Dubois, Sappho offers an alternative to the Platonic champion of rational and ideal truth over everyday human experience and corporeality. The renewed interest among some philosophers to uncover and bring to light lesser-known figures from the history of ideas encourages us to inquire whether Sappho might be an underappreciated thinker. In this presentation, I consider Sappho's work in terms of its philosophical merit apropos of its content, regardless of the lack of philosophical form or argumentation, exploring philosophy qua erosophy. In so doing, I aim to show not only Pace Dubois and Barnard that Sappho's particular way of thinking about and expressing this content places her among the earliest great thinkers in Western philosophical history, but also that her songs disclose a love of wisdom, even if Dubois is correct that they are not philosophical in the Platonic sense. Is the speed okay? Are you under? Okay. That's okay. Oh, no, it works. No, okay. Maybe I was putting it wrong. Thank you. Danke. Despite that some scholars have extolled Sappho's remarkable staying power over the past 2,700 years, even if we aren't always cognizant of it, others have criticized how little we actually know definitively about who she was and the life she lived. In his foreword to Mary Bernard's celebrated 1994 translation of Sappho's Fragments, Dudley Fitz put it this way: "We've heard a great deal about Sappho, and we know almost nothing." Fitting with Dubois' claim that Sappho is only a name, that it is impossible to know more. While not a lot is known definitively about Sappho's life, the 10th century Suda, an encyclopedia compiled from ancient Greek sources, tells us basic biographical information, though its content is not without debate. According to the Suda, Sappho lived at Lesbos, but was originally from Eressos, flourished during the 42nd Olympiad, which is about 612 to 608 BCE. Her family consisted of her father Simon, mother Cleis, daughter also Cleis, and husband Chariklos. It is believed that she was a teacher, and the Suda names her pupils Anagra of Miletos, Gongola of Colophon, and Unica of Salamis. In addition, it names her female companions, with whom she was said to have had a shameful relationship: Athis, Telesippa, and Megara. It also tells us that she was the author of 9 books of lyric songs, as well as epigrams, elegiacs, iambics, solo songs, and that she invented the plectrum. As Mary Bernard explains, Mytilene, the capital city of the island of Lesbos and Sappho's home, was a bustling and cosmopolitan city in the 6th and 7th centuries BCE. It joins other ancient cities at this time, not only trade, but also new ideas and traditions flourished. 3 other such coastal towns, Miletus, Ephesus, and Samos, were after all the respective homes of the earlier Ionian philosophers: Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras. Given the context of Sappho's life, when she was born and where she came of age, it is not altogether surprising that she was able to become an original thinker and creative. So for anyone not familiar with the pre-Socratic philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, they were the earliest Greek thinkers. We consider Thales typically the first philosopher in the West. So that she was living in the same time in the same area seems to mean something, because we always are trying to figure out, how did Thales decide to, predict a solar eclipse and become the first, use rationality? So there was probably a lot of freedom for intellectual thought in this time. So the reality of this context, the specific time and place of Sappho's life and work, means that we must be careful to treat Sappho as we've learned to treat the rest of the earliest Greek thinkers, the so-called pre-Socratics. Not unlike the pre-Socratics, only a fraction of Sappho's work survives today, and we rely on surviving fragments, together with testimony about her work from later thinkers, to construct impressions of and ideas about her and her work. We must also realize that most of what she wrote, which again could be upwards of 9 papyrus scrolls, is completely lost. In fact, there's likely only one complete Sapphic song extant. Not unlike the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who wrote aphoristically, or an epic poet like Homer, who wrote in meter, it is also important to keep in mind that Sappho's poetry was written to be sung to music. Like Heraclitus and Homer, she used certain words because they were playing a double role, one in terms of meaning and communication, and in terms of syllabic fit for a certain melody or tone. Unfortunately, we no longer have the music. But this is why you can find, there are many wonderful Sappho translators, but there are also many hobbyists. You can Google on the internet different poems, and people have put out their ideas of maybe what they mean. So now to talk about Sappho as an orosopher of being. The Greek word philia, which is the heart of the word philosophy, is only one of 6 Greek terms for love. It connotes a love born of friendship. Such a love isn't fraught with impatience. It isn't typically personal. As Aristotle shows in the Metaphysics, it likely comes from wonder and curiosity. As philosophers going back to Plato have pointed out, there are other ways to love wisdom. For example, the Greek word eros meaning a desirous type of love could be driving someone toward wisdom. It might come as a surprise that in the symposium, let's see, there we go. It might come as a surprise that in the symposium, Socrates announces the only thing he knows is the art of eros. Didn't he tell us in the Apology that he knows nothing? In the symposium passage, there's a play on words between eros and the Greek term for asking questions. In short, Socrates might be suggesting that asking questions is the art of eros, and we know he knew how to ask questions. I consider this the Socratic interpretation. Another way to understand the passage is that Socrates understands an analogical rather than a literal link between eros and asking questions. As questions seek answers, eros seeks to know or something, not excluding oneself. The wisdom eros seeks, at least in some contexts, is not expressible in language or verifiably true. Loving wisdom about someone or something, so again, including oneself, this is a way for self-knowledge as well, in particular is eventful, it's open-ended, it's dynamic. I call this the Sapphic interpretation. Following from the idea of the Sapphic interpretation, I would like to call Sappho an orosopher, a term for one engaged with what Nina Belmonte defines as a love of wisdom that dwells in difference and desire as the mode of its true calling. And while I can't get into it here, I write more about it in this chapter that I wrote about Nina Belmonte and this idea of orosophy opening up philosophy to difference, to open-endedness. Also, Lewis Gordon has recently, called us to rethink philosophy as a practice and for it to be more open-ended, accepting of difference, different epistemic ways of knowing the world. Sappho's expressions of desire and longing for certain beloveds disclose this orosophy of being, which materializes the result of her experience of them. For example, Fragment 31, Longinus on Sublimity, articulates a complex sensual experience associated with her desire for another. So I've given one translation here, but I'm going to read out Mary Barnard's translation, which is slightly different. He's a god in my eyes, the man who's allowed to sit beside you, he who listens intimately to the sweet murmur of your voice, the enticing laughter that makes my own heart beat fast. If I meet you suddenly, I can't speak. My tongue is broken. A thin flame runs under my skin. Seeing nothing, hearing only my own ears drumming, I drip with sweat. Trembling shakes my body, and I turn paler than dry grass. At such times, death isn't far from me. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of what I wrote to kind of talk extemporaneously about this poem. I really like the way that Barnard translates it, because some have called it a jealousy poem, that the point of the poem is that she's jealous of her beloved's friend or perhaps other paramour who's sitting opposite her. But I think it's clear from Barnard's translation that that's not the point. The point is, this is the 6th century BCE, and there are no philosophers at this time, and there's only other kinds of lyric poetry. And Sappho is writing about her body, about the phenomenology of her own desire, and comparing it to this man who seemingly can sit opposite her object of desire and just listen. And Sappho's recognizing and expressing that her own body is changing as a result of the way she feels for this other person. And so I think this is remarkable that she wrote about that she acknowledged this, that she wrote about this, that she compared it to other ways of being with another person, that she put her body in the way that in her sensual experience at the forefront of this interaction and of this way of being with this other person. To go as far as to then say it's almost if she were dying, right? So she's also thinking about her mortality vis-a-vis the sensual experience So Sappho's Eros is vividly described in fragments 47 and 48 as well. In fragment 47 is preserved in Maximus of Tyre's Orations. Love shook my heart like a wind falling on oaks on a mountain. So now we have this comparison to nature, right? She sees a connection between her own heart and the effect of another person on her body, a part of her body, as analogical or as like the way that nature is affected, right, by something similarly dramatic. It's interesting here. So I was talking about word usage before. The word being translated as heart here is the Greek phrenos, rendered in Anne Carson's translation as mind. Sappho does not use the term thumos, often translated heart in other fragments, nor a cognate of nous, the more standard term to mean a thinking mind. It was common in early Greek literature for phrenos to mean both mind and heart. For example, whereas in Homer's Iliad, we see the term contrasted with noi in Book 1, heart versus mind in the Odyssey, we see it contrasted with thumos, mind versus heart. In Aeschylus's Choephori, it is used to describe a speech from the heart. And in Agamemnon, it is paired with philos to describe something not done carelessly or superficially. Later in Plato's Timaeus and in Aristotle's zoological works, the term designates a part of the body, the midriff. And indeed, in Little and Scott provide these references and more for the four main uses of the term phrene and its cognates. So midriff, heart, mind, and will purpose. This is important because Sappho is, we don't know, it's not too clear if she understands the heart and mind as one thing or as different. I'm running out of time. I'm still two loquacious, even with all this help of writing out a paper. And I just lost my, okay. So maximum of Tyros comments. Yes. Socrates says Eros is a sophist. Sappho calls him a weaver of tales. Socrates is driven mad for Phaedrus by Eros, while Sappho's heart is shaken by Eros like a wind falling on oaks on a mountain. The contrast provided between Eros's effect on Socrates versus its effect on Sappho helps us further to see that Sappho's Eros is different than Socrates's Eros. Socrates's Eros represents the antithesis of philosophy, irrational, mentally maddening, uncontrollable. Sappho's Eros also takes hold of her, but the image has to do with her heart, or put another way, with the mind in her chest. Put frankly, desire does not make Sappho lose her mind. As Christina Clark explains, Sappho leaves the speaker's intellectual capacity intact and unaffected. On the other hand, desire shakes her heart, and thus both her feelings and her body to the core. It is like an aha moment, only possible by way of desire and not brought on by questions, analysis, or thinking. So here I'm trying to say it's another entry into finding wisdom. It's another thing that sparks us rather than intentionally asking questions. And this is another part of Belmonte's orosophy or Lewis Gordon's new philosophy, is that there are other ways to decide that we want to know things. Okay, so in another fragment from the Orations, Tyre contrasts Diotima's or Plato's definitions of Eros with Sappho's. Diotima says that love, Eros, flourishes when he is abundance, but dies when he is in need. Sappho combined these ideas and called love bittersweet and pain giver. In fragment 26, Sappho notes that for those whom I treat well, harm me most of all. So she embraces what might have been for her a dual nature of Eros, rather than thinking of it in terms of extremes. Okay. And so now let me try to conclude here. Okay, and so I'll say very quickly, I'm going to skip this section, but I'll say very quickly that there's been some really helpful analysis during a time where women in ancient philosophy started to really be studied in the 1980s. Eva Stela has a brilliant analysis of actually how, even compared to other lyric poets, Sappho was doing something totally different in her time. And Eva Stela says that it has to do with the fact that she's female, that she's describing a particularly female way of loving and being loved. And so I think this is a really interesting analysis to look at today, to talk about different ways of loving and knowing. You know, we don't have to commit ourselves to the binary of male and female. We can think about just different ways of knowing, different ways of gendered knowing, right? And so Stella contrasts it with the typical male lyric poets of her time. For example, Anacreon, "O child virgin glancing, I seek you, but you do not hear, not knowing that you are the charioteer of my soul." So Stella talks about how these typical male lyric poets describe Eros as a conquest, that they are, you know, taking over some typically young, unknowing female, and then they're finished. Whereas, not unlike, you know, it's an analogy with the female orgasm that, you know, for Sappho, Eros is never done. It's iterative, it's cyclical. And so her desire, like the desire of a philosopher to keep knowing, is continual. And so I think her way of interpreting her own desire, whether it's female desire, just a different way of knowing, is also a different kind of model for philosophy, that we are never finished answering the question, that it's iterative, that it's cyclical. So let me finish here.
Yeah.
I keep trying to do, so there. Thank you.